My name is Beth Maluski, and this is A Soldier's Life in the Trenches During World War I. World War I was also known as the Great War, the War to End All Wars, and the Trench War. Today's learning targets. I can explain what trench life and war was like for a soldier. I can formulate my own opinion through a reflection after participating in a simulation. The trenches were a world below ground. By the end of the war, soldiers on both sides had dug 15,000 miles of trenches. That would be the equivalent to digging across the United States 5 times. So how did all the digging begin? Trenches are not a new concept. They had been used going back as far as medieval warfare and as recent as the Civil War. But they did not become an indispensable part of war until 1914. Advances in weapons technology kept each side from gaining a significant advantage. As soon as the advancing side moved, the defending army fired at will from the protection of trenches. A war of movement? And that's a question. World War I was typified by its lack of movement, years of stalemate, and life in the trenches. That is not to say that there wasn't movement at all. At the onset of World War I, it was expected to be a short war, as are most wars in the beginning. However, the Western Front from 1914 to 1918 saw the dramatic advances in technology, and as soldiers retreated to their trenches for safety, stalemate soon set in. This is a short video explaining what life was like for soldiers in the trenches.
World War I is famous for the use of trench warfare. Trenches were used from Gallipoli to the Western Front. They were a series of ditches hand-dug into the ground to protect the soldiers from enemy bullets and artillery. Soldiers would fight, eat, and sleep in the trenches. No man's land between the trenches was the most deadly place to be. Aside from the typical threats of war, soldiers were also dying from the miserable conditions. Unwashed men and dead bodies were a shock to soldiers arriving for the first time. Lice, ticks, and flies were a major problem, causing never-ending itches and spreading trench fever. Millions of rats lived in the trenches, feeding on the scraps of war. Some grew to be the size of cats. Standing in the wet, muddy conditions on the Western Front caused trench foot, which could lead to amputations. The New Zealand soldiers lived on a grueling diet of corned beef, jam, and stew, topped off with hard, dry biscuits. At Gallipoli, the Anzacs had few grenades, so they turned their empty jam tins into homemade bombs. During the war, a new deadly weapon was deployed: poison gas. Soldiers would cover their faces with rags soaked in urine until gas masks were developed to give them better protection. By the end of World War I, advances in more mobile technology changed the way wars would be fought in the future.
Let's now look at the anatomy of a trench. A trench was approximately 10 feet deep. They had duck-board wood at the bottom, dugouts for sleeping. The Germans, who anticipated a much longer war, in many cases ran electricity and had much nicer trenches. They were organized in rows. The lines, especially the front lines, zigzagged, so if an enemy jumped in, he could not get very far or shoot or injure many people. The land in between the two sides was known as no man's land. Daily death in the trenches. Death was a constant companion to those serving in the line, even when no raid or attack was launched or defended against. Busy sectors saw the constant shell fire directed by the enemy, which brought random death, whether their victims were lounging in a trench or lying in a dugout. Many men were buried as a consequence of such large shell bursts. Soldiers new to arrive were cautioned against their natural inclination to peer over the top of the trench into no man's land. Many men sadly died on their first day in the trenches as a consequence of a precisely aimed sniper's bullet. It has been estimated that up to one-third of Allied casualties on the Western Front were actually sustained in the trenches. Rats. Millions of rats infested the trenches. There were two main types of rats, the brown and the black. Both were despised, but the brown rat was especially feared. They would gorge themselves on human remains, grotesquely disfiguring them by eating their eyes and liver. They could grow to the size of a cat. The men were afraid of these rats, which would even scamper across their faces in the dark. They would attempt to rid the trenches of them by various methods, such as shooting them, bayoneting them, and even clubbing them to death. It was, however, futile. A single rat could produce up to 900 offspring in just 1 year. These rats would spread infection and contaminate food. The rat problem remained for the duration of the war. Frogs, lice, and worse. It gets worse than just the rats. Rats, sadly, were not the only source of infestation and nuisance. Lice was a never-ending problem, breeding in the seams of filthy clothing and causing men to itch unceasingly. Even when clothing was periodically washed and deloused, lice eggs invariably remained hidden in the seams. Within hours of the clothing being reworn, the body heat generated would cause the eggs to hatch. Lice caused trench fever, a particularly painful disease that began suddenly with severe pain followed by high fever. Recovery took place away from the trenches and took up to 12 weeks or 3 months. The lice were not actually identified as the culprit of trench fever until near the end of the war in 1918. However, they became such a nuisance that in World War I is when soldiers began with the military haircut of shaving their head to keep the lice out of their head. Frogs. Frogs by the score were found in shell holes covered in water. They were also found in the base of trenches. Slugs and horn beetles also crowded the sides of trenches. Trench foot was another medical condition to trench life. It's a fungal infection of the feet caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary trench conditions. It can turn gangrenous and result in amputation. Trench foot was more of a problem at the beginning of the war, and as soldiers learned and trench conditions improved, it faded, although cases continued throughout the entire war. The trench cycle. Soldiers would be put on a rotation or a cycle. Typically, a battalion would be expected to serve a spell at the front line. This would be followed by a stint spent in support and then in the reserve lines. A period of rest would follow, generally short in duration, before the whole cycle of trench duty would start again. The cycle was determined by the necessity of the situation. Even while at rest, men might find themselves tasked with duties that placed them in the line of fire. Others would spend far longer in the front line than usual, usually in the more busy sectors. For an example, and while the numbers varied, these are estimates for example's sake. A soldier might expect to spend 70 days on the front line, 30 days in the support trenches, 120 in the reserve trenches, and 70 days at rest. And on average, a soldier could expect up to 2 weeks leave in a year. Morning routine began an hour before dawn, and it was called the stand to and morning hate. The daily routine in the trenches was ordered by a company orderly officer. Soldiers would climb up the fire steps to guard against a dawn raid by the enemy with their bayonets fixed. This policy was adopted by both sides, and despite the knowledge that each side prepared itself for raids or attacks timed at dawn, many were actually carried out at this time. Accompanying the stand to as light grew was the daily ritual, often termed the morning hate. Both sides would relieve the tension of the early hours with machine gun fire, shelling, and small arms fire directed into the mist to the front. This made doubly sure of safety at dawn. Rum rifles and the breakfast truce. With stand to over, in some areas, rum might be issued to the soldiers. They would then attend to cleaning their rifle equipment to have it inspected by officers. Breakfast would also be served. In essentially every area of the lines, at some time or another, each side would adopt unofficial truces while breakfast was served and eaten. The truce often extended to the wagons which delivered the food. Truces such as these seldom lasted long, though. Inevitably, a senior officer would hear of its existence and quickly stamp it out. Nevertheless, it persisted throughout the war and was more prevalent in the quieter sectors of the lines. Daily chores. With breakfast over, the men would be inspected by the company or platoon commander, and they would assign daily chores to each soldier, except those who had been excused for duty for a variety of reasons, including medical. Examples would include refilling sandbags, repairing the duck boards on the floor of the trench, draining the trenches, because during particularly heavy rainfalls, trenches could quickly accumulate muddy water, making life especially miserable and causing trench walls to collapse. So pumping equipment was available for the draining of trenches. Men would also be assigned to repair the trenches. Others, unlucky, would be assigned to latrine duty. Boredom. Boredom was a daily condition. Given that each side's front line was constantly under watch by snipers and lookouts during daylight, movement was logically restricted until night fell. That means once men had concluded their assigned tasks, they were free to attend to personal matters such as reading and writing, sending letters home. Meals were prepared, sleep was snatched whenever possible, although it was seldom that men were allowed sufficient time to get more than a few minutes before they were detailed to another task. The evening routine. With the onset of dusk, the morning ritual of stand to was repeated, again to guard against a surprise attack launched as light fell. Following this, the trenches became a hive of activity. Supply and maintenance activities could be undertaken, although danger invariably accompanied these, as the enemy would be alert for such movement. Men would be sent to the rear lines to fetch rations and waters. Other men would be assigned sentry duty or watch duty on the fire steps. Generally, men would be expected to provide sentry duty for up to 2 hours. Any longer, and there was the real risk of them falling asleep on duty. And the penalty for falling asleep on sentry duty was death by firing squad. No man's land. Patrols would often be sent out into the land between the two fronts, which was called no man's land. It was separated by barbed wire to try and deter the other side from entering your trench. Men would be tasked with repairing or adding barbed wire as needed. Others, however, would go out on assigned listening posts, hoping to pick up valuable information from the enemy lines. Sometimes enemy patrols would encounter one another in no man's land. They were then faced with some difficult options. They could either hurry on their separate ways or engage in hand-to-hand combat. They could not afford to fire their weapons while patrolling no man's land because the sound of the gunfire would attract deadly attention from both sides, getting all involved killed. Relieving the front. Men were relieved from frontline duty at night. Relieving units would wind their way through the numerous lines of communication trenches, reserve trenches, and support trenches, weighted down with equipment and trench stores, such as shovels, picks, corrugated iron, duckboard, and so on. The process of relieving a line could take several frustrating hours. And no explanation of life in the trenches would be complete without a complete understanding of the smell. And while they are wearing gas masks in this picture, that was not because of the trench odor, that was due to chemical warfare. However, it made a humorous. However, trenches had an appalling reek. The odor was said to strike visitors by the numerous conflicting sources of odors. Rotting carcasses lay around by the thousands, many of which lay in shallow graves. Overflowing latrines would give off a most offensive stench. Men who had not been afforded the luxury of a bath in weeks or months would offer the pervading odor of dried sweat. Their feet gave off the worst foot odor. Trenches would also smell of creosol or chloride lime used to keep off constant threat of disease and infection. Adding to this the smell of quartide, the lingering odor of poison gas, rotting sandbags, stagnant mud, cigarette smoke, and cooking food. However, men grew used to it after a while, although it thoroughly overcame first-time visitors. Ugh. So what I would now like for you to do is have a think, pair, share. Think to yourself, go through, what was trench warfare like? Once you have formulated your thoughts, share them with your seat partner, and in just a few minutes we will have a whole class share out. Now for the simulation portion of the class. You all will be given a trench. We will use our desks in rows as trenches. Well, in these trenches, you will write a letter home to a loved one while you are not fighting. For the purpose of class, you will use balled up paper, and when instructed, you will be able to fire across to the other trenches. You may not lift your head above the tops of the desks. If I tell you that you have died from a disease or have fallen ill, you must stop fighting immediately. When the simulation is over, you will draw a line underneath the letter, whether or not you have completed it, and write a one-paragraph reflection on your thoughts about the war. You will reflect on what happened while you were in combat, what you think about trench warfare, and has this simulation and understanding changed your thoughts about war in general? Today's class was based on the futility of warfare. You had a chance to write a letter home while reenacting a trench situation. Tonight, your homework is to write a one-paragraph reflection, as discussed previously. For example, this might be your letter. Dear Mom, it's Christmas time and I really want to be home. The trench is cold and many people are sick. However, morale is high. The sergeant believes that the Central Powers will win the war by spring. There was an attack today and many people died. I am lucky to still be here. Your reflection might begin with trench warfare didn't really mean much to me until I was actually part of a simulation. I actually lived until the end, but many of my friends died in combat. The letter actually made it realistic to me because I did not know if this would be the last time I would talk to my mother. I would like for your reflections to be at minimum 5 to 6 complete sentences, but this gives you a good starting overview. And this concludes our presentation on trenches during World War I. Thank you.